There are stories in music history that never lose their sting, no matter how many years pass. Behind the stage lights and iconic songs, Joan Baez carried memories that were as painful as they were unforgettable. Her connection with Bob Dylan, once filled with admiration and love, eventually turned into one of the most heartbreaking chapters of her life. Now, looking back in her 80s, she speaks with raw honesty about the disappointments, betrayals, and wounds that never truly faded. The spark that changed everything. In 1959, Joan Baez was only 18 years old when her voice stunned audiences at the Newport Folk Festival. Performing alongside Bob Gibson, she captivated the crowd with her clear soprano, instantly earning the title of the Barefoot Madonna. That night launched her career and placed her at the very center of the American folk revival. Just 2 years later, in 1961, her path crossed with a young, struggling songwriter named Bob Dylan. He was still unknown outside of Greenwich Village coffeehouses, rough around the edges, with a restless ambition that could not be ignored. Baez, already hailed as the Queen of Folk, saw something in Dylan that others had not yet recognized. She began inviting him on stage during her concerts, sharing her spotlight, and offering him credibility in front of thousands who trusted her musical judgment. On stage, their voices blended seamlessly, creating harmonies that carried a sense of intimacy that audiences could feel immediately. "I always liked singing and playing with her," Dylan later recalled. "I thought our voices really blended well. We could sing just about any kind of thing and make it make sense." For Baez, those early years were filled with love and admiration, both for the man and for his art. By 1962, she was already covering Dylan's songs in her own concerts and recordings, helping his lyrics reach wider audiences. On her live album, Joan Baez in Concert, she performed "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right," marking the beginning of her role as Dylan's most devoted interpreter. Dylan himself praised her influence, saying she had a heart-stopping soprano voice that he could never forget. Their partnership wasn't just musical, it was personal. They were lovers, collaborators, and public symbols of a new generation of folk musicians who used music as protest and poetry. But even in those early days of triumph, the seeds of imbalance were already being planted. Joan had helped bring Dylan into the spotlight, but soon the spotlight would shift entirely to him, and she would find herself standing in the shadows of the very man she once carried forward: fame, distance, and betrayal. By the mid-1960s, the delicate balance between Joan Baez and Bob Dylan had shifted in ways that neither of them fully anticipated. What began as a partnership of equals, built on mutual admiration and shared stages at festivals and concert halls around the world, started to unravel as Dylan's career skyrocketed almost overnight. His songs, including "Blowin' in the Wind" (1963) and "The Times They Are A-Changin" (1964), became anthems of a generation, tackling civil rights, anti-war sentiments, and political injustices with a voice that resonated far beyond folk circles. Dylan's rapid ascent not only reshaped popular music, it thrust him into a spotlight far larger than the folk community he had initially been part of, inspiring legendary figures like the Beatles and solidifying his status as the voice of the era. For Joan Baez, who had been instrumental in introducing Dylan to audiences, driving him to venues, encouraging him to perform, and frequently sharing the stage in duets, the sudden intensity of his fame was bittersweet. She later reflected, "I think that his fame happened so fast and it was so huge that I kinda got lost in the shuffle." Her words were far from exaggeration. While they had once performed side by side, sharing microphones and harmonizing on classics like "With God on Our Side" and "It Ain't Me, Babe," the dynamic changed as Dylan became increasingly enveloped in his own growing legend. His tours expanded, his entourage multiplied, and new musicians, managers, and industry professionals entered his orbit. In this environment, Joan often found herself on the sidelines, a partner left waiting for acknowledgement. The 1965 United Kingdom tour crystallized the tension. Joan traveled with Dylan, expecting to perform alongside him as they had for years, but he refused her participation on stage. The rejection was public and private at once. She waited in hotel rooms, rehearsed songs she would never sing that night, and endured the humiliation of being excluded from what had once been a shared spotlight. The emotional sting of this experience was profound. Joan's admiration for Dylan, which had once been a source of joy and creative inspiration, turned into disillusionment. The partnership of equals that fans had admired now felt painfully one-sided, with Dylan consumed by the pressures of his fame and Joan sidelined both professionally and personally. Years later, Dylan acknowledged his missteps, admitting, "I was just trying to deal with the madness that had become my career. And unfortunately, she got swept up along, and I felt very bad about it. I was sorry to ever see our relationship end." At the time, however, no apology was forthcoming, leaving Joan to navigate the heartbreak alone. She had sacrificed her own spotlight for the rise of another, only to find herself abandoned in the wake of his meteoric success. What had once been a mutual, creative, and romantic bond now became a lesson in the cost of fame. The fragility of relationships under the glare of the public eye, and the personal toll of being left behind when the world moves forward without you. The public and private divide. By the mid-1960s, Joan Baez had built a reputation as the queen of folk music, admired for her purity of voice and her unwavering dedication to social causes. Yet behind the acclaim, she felt the personal cost of her devotion to Dylan, growing heavier with each passing season. In 1965, she joined him on his tour through England, hoping to rekindle the connection that had once felt so natural. Instead, she found herself sidelined. While Dylan was surrounded by new collaborators, journalists, and an entourage that shielded him from unwanted distractions, Joan was left to watch from the periphery. She later admitted the experience felt humiliating, as though she had gone from being a trusted partner to a forgotten guest. The public began to sense the imbalance. Joan, who had once invited Dylan to share her stage, was now absent from his performances. Their dynamic shifted in the eyes of fans, who had once celebrated them as equals in music and purpose. In interviews years later, Joan revealed the quiet despair of that period, how she was torn between admiration for Dylan's genius and the growing awareness that his personal demons, his ambition and his guarded nature, would never allow for the relationship she had envisioned. This period also coincided with Dylan's artistic transformation. His embrace of electric instruments in 1965 divided the folk community, and Joan's own career was caught in the crossfire. She defended him publicly, even as purists turned on him, but in private she questioned where she fit in his rapidly changing world. The emotional isolation gnawed at her. She confessed decades later that Dylan rarely acknowledged the sacrifices she made, from enduring boos at concerts to defending his choices when others condemned him. What made the heartbreak sharper was that Joan had built so much of her life around the hope that their paths would remain intertwined. She had lent her platform, her credibility, and her energy to support him, only to discover that once Dylan's star rose, he no longer needed or wanted that support. This realization cut deep, leaving her with wounds that would take decades to heal. Silence, distance, and lingering regret. After the painful experiences of the mid-1960s, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan drifted apart both personally and professionally. By 1966, Dylan had withdrawn from the public eye following a mysterious motorcycle accident. And Joan, left on the outside once again, realized their connection was no longer part of his life. For her, the silence was devastating. In interviews much later, she described how Dylan had simply vanished without explanation, leaving her with unanswered questions and a deep sense of abandonment. The late 1960s and 1970s forced Joan to redefine herself outside of his shadow. She poured her energy into activism, lending her voice to the anti-Vietnam War movement and later to humanitarian causes around the world. While she found purpose in these battles, her personal life remained haunted by Dylan's absence. She confessed in her memoir that no other relationship ever carried the same intensity, nor left the same scars. Dylan, meanwhile, reinvented himself repeatedly, dabbling in country music, disappearing into domestic life, and later finding renewed fame in the 1970s. Joan watched from a distance, admiring his work, but never able to bridge the emotional chasm that had formed between them. When they did occasionally cross paths, the encounters were often fraught with unspoken tension. In 1975, Dylan invited Joan to join him on the Rolling Thunder Revue, a tour filled with energy and experimentation. She accepted, hoping that perhaps the years apart had softened their wounds. Instead, she was reminded again of his distance. While the music was electric and their performances together captured audiences, behind the scenes, Dylan kept her at arm's length. In one interview, Joan admitted that she felt like she was playing a role in his world rather than being welcomed back into his heart. These cycles of closeness and estrangement weighed heavily on her. Each time she allowed herself to hope, she was met with disappointment. The most tragic part, as Joan later explained, was not the absence of love, but the absence of acknowledgement. Dylan rarely spoke about their relationship, rarely admitted the impact she had on his career, and never offered the closure she longed for. For Joan, the unanswered silence became its own kind of torment, a ghost that followed her well into her later years. Confronting the past. By the 1980s and 1990s, Joan Baez had reached a stage in life where reflection became unavoidable. She continued touring, recording, and standing at the front lines of political movements. But her personal history with Bob Dylan never fully left her. It lingered in interviews, in fan questions, and even in her own music. Songs like Diamonds and Rust, released in 1975, were thinly veiled accounts of their turbulent bond, capturing both the tenderness and the betrayal that defined it. The song became one of her signature pieces, a cathartic attempt to put into words the confusion that Dylan's silence had left behind. In her autobiography, published decades later, Joan did not hold back. She admitted that the relationship, while passionate, had also been deeply painful. She described Dylan as a man who could be brilliant and intoxicating one moment, cold and dismissive the next. She recalled nights of vulnerability followed by mornings of distance, moments where she felt she had glimpsed the real person behind his guarded mask, only to watch him retreat again into silence. For Joan, these contradictions created what she called relationship nightmares, a cycle of hope and heartbreak that shaped much of her emotional life. By the late 1990s, there were brief signs of reconciliation. Dylan invited Joan on stage during some of his concerts, and while their performances rekindled a kind of magic, it was clear that the intimacy they once shared was gone. In interviews, Joan admitted that she no longer expected answers from him. What she wanted more than anything was honesty, an acknowledgement of the past, an admission that what they had mattered. But Dylan, ever elusive, never gave her that satisfaction. For Joan, confronting the past meant accepting that closure might never come from him. Instead, she found it in her own voice, in telling her side of the story, and in using the pain as fuel for her art. Yet even as she moved forward, she acknowledged that the shadows of their relationship remained. At 83, she finally admitted that the ghosts of that love, its promises, its betrayals, and its silences, were never far from her heart. Living with the Echoes. In her later years, Joan Baez spoke with striking honesty about what it meant to live with the echoes of a love that never found its resolution. She admitted that Dylan had been the great romance of her life, but also the one that left her with the deepest wounds. She described the years of waiting for recognition that never came, the way she defended him publicly while he withdrew privately, and the strange ache of watching him age into legend without ever truly acknowledging their bond. For Joan, the tragedy was not only in the love lost, but in the silence that followed it. As time passed, her reflections grew more tender, but never less painful. She said that Dylan had inspired some of her greatest music, but he had also left scars that shaped her understanding of intimacy and trust. Even decades later, when fans asked about him, her answers carried both affection and sorrow. She confessed that their story was a reminder of how brilliance and cruelty can live in the same person, and how the people who change our lives the most can also break us the hardest. By the time she reached her 80s, Joan no longer chased closure. Instead, she accepted the reality that Dylan would always remain a mystery, both to her and to the world. What mattered now was that she had spoken her truth. Through her memoirs, her interviews, and her music, she finally revealed the private heartbreaks she had carried for so long. Her courage to share them, even after decades of silence, was her way of reclaiming power from a relationship that had once left her powerless. In the end, Joan Baez's life is defined not just by her music and activism, but by the love story that shaped her in ways both beautiful and tragic. A story of devotion, betrayal, silence, and survival, etched forever in the songs that still echo today. What do you think about Joan Baez finally opening up about her painful past with Bob Dylan? Do you believe love like theirs can ever truly heal? Or do the scars remain forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the legends of music.